Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is David Mayhew, Sterling Professor Emeritus of Political Science. Professor Mayhew is widely considered one of the leading scholars on the American Congress. He has authored numerous works on Congress, political parties, elections, and policymaking, including Congress, the Electoral Connection, Divided We Govern, America's Congress, Electoral Realignments, Parties and Policies, and Partisan Balance. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, a member of the American Philosophical Society and the National Academy of Sciences, and a recipient of the James Madison and Samuel J. Eldersveld Awards for career contributions. Today we talk with Professor Mayhew about his new book, The Imprint of Congress. Welcome, Professor Mayhew.
Glad to be here, yes.
So let's start with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Well, it is, let's see, The Imprint of Congress, okay. And it's about, I'm writing about the effect or the result of what Congress does, rather than whether it looks good or whether it does what the president wants us to do or whatever, or whether the public like what Congress is doing. As you read the headlines, and generally speaking, Congress is down in the tank. And it's a history book. It's over 2.25 centuries, which is American history all the way back to the beginning. Congress has been here a long time. And that's what it is. I want to see the imprint of Congress in a series of policy areas, or let's say agendas that have been out there, or challenges that have been out there, and see what Congress's role is. And I've planned this so that I'm looking at, let's say, impulses, policy or performance impulses that have obtained across a whole bunch of relative peer countries at different times, like as in building a welfare state, or responding to the Great Depression, or handling debt and deficit right now, and for that matter, building a nation in the first place back here in the 1790s. So I'm trying to look at Congress's distinctive performance or contribution to what went on in this succession of impulses, regardless of if we like what they did. We may find appalling. I mean, the history of America having to do with race is not great, after all, going back there. And I mean, blacks were not represented, African Americans represented in Congress appropriately until fairly recently. So we have to realize that too. That's about where we are.
Okay. So you've been looking at Congress for years now, decades, in fact. What was the impetus for you writing this book? Why write it?
There was a particular spur. There was a conference at Columbia a couple of years ago, and the people who were invited were charged to do a paper about Congress as a handler of policies of public affairs. So I wrote a long paper. I took seriously the charge and wrote a paper. That was a preface to this, and then it expanded a little bit into a journal article, and now it's tripled in size into a book. The book's almost finished.
Okay.
Also, I'm reading. I do a lot of reading.
Yes, I know.
That's
you
where
read
I spend
2
my
books
time
a
reading.
week, I hear.
So I'd come across a lot of stuff out there in books about American history. A lot of it not really principally about Congress, but impinging on Congress, as writing about things, policy areas, and such. So I had stuff stacked up in my head that I could draw on, or in my notes, and also I was tired of doing. Never write the same book twice, is my view. I mean, go on to something different, try something, tackle something different, go after a different buffalo.
Right. So what was your methodology for the book? How did you do the research for it?
It's entirely from reading. It's entirely out of secondary sources. There's nothing in the way of primary sources or interviews or statistical data sets or whatever. It's from secondary sources.
And how many did you pull in to use?
Oh, it's well up in the hundreds. I mean,
really?
Secondary sources,
Yeah.
journal articles, books, I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds probably. Some economic history, for example. A lot of very good economic history talks about what Congress has been up to and the consequences thereof over the last 225 years.
Right. Okay, so let's get to these impetuses, these impulses.
Impulses,
yes, sorry. There are 13 of them.
Yeah.
How did you come up with the 13?
Well, what I looked for was, first, it's transnational. I didn't want to look at local American things. I wanted to look at what causes or impulses or challenges or agendas that have transnational presence over England, France, and so forth, other countries at different times, to see how the U.S. fit into such transnational impulses. So that was a guide to it all.
Right.
So, and I wanted the big stuff, like building a welfare state or responding to the Depression in the 1930s, or civil rights, the civil rights revolution after World War II. These are big enterprises,
Right.
big challenge, big impulses out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's pick one, for instance. You can either go with the debt crisis
Yeah.
or our environmental
Yep,
challenges
okay.
that we face.
Yep.
What have you found in terms of Congress's imprint on those?
Pick one. All right. Well,
Or
let's
talk about both of them.
that'll
if
be
you'd like.
fine. Let's look at that deficit, right?
Okay.
That slash deficit.
Okay.
Now that's a problem and an agenda and across the world in the last few decades. It's a big problem. I mean, the economies were humming in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the governments learned how to spend money. But then the economies have been growing most slowly since about 1973, which has put pressure on and governments like to spend. So it puts pressure all over the place. So it's a very common problem, and it's perceived also as a common problem and acted on. To pick up the newspaper and there it is. What are we doing about that deficit? So, what is the U.S. doing now? And here's what I find on that. It's very interesting. I mean, you can see what other countries doing, what the Congress is doing. Generally speaking, American performance on that front is about average. There's nothing exceptional about the U.S. It's not more spendthrifty or more stupid in the way it does money. On the other hand, it's right there with the pack. So you look at that and you say, oh, well, the U.S., it's not great the way almost any country is doing this, but it's probably unrealistic to expect that countries are going to exceed greatly an average as they. That isn't to say you shouldn't try, but nonetheless, there we are. Now, within that, it's interesting to see how the U.S. and other countries have handled the fisc or the debt deficit problem, all that spending and so forth. Starting in 2008, when the Wall Street crisis came down, that's after all a big problem right there in its own right. And there the story is quite interesting. That is, I mean, to consider all this, by the way, you have to look at what the presidency is doing, not just what the Congress is doing. So throughout the book, I look at the performance of the presidency as well as the performance of the Congress. You have to do that. You have to partial out the presidency and the Congress and try to get a fix on what Congress distinctively is doing. I think you do anyway. On that front, it's quite interesting to see the American performance, so to speak, in the last 5-6 years or so. For one thing, responding to the Wall Street crisis, after all, the crunch, I mean, the dip in the economy, the Great Recession, they call it. The American counterfactual stimulus, spend money, was among the biggest or the biggest as a percentage of the economy and across some 30 countries in the developed world. So really, the U.S. was out front and spending money, as would be suggested by many economists, after all, in trying to address this thing. That's mostly a presidential accomplishment. It comes down through early Obama, a little bit of it in late Bush, but early Obama. You look at that and you say there. But still, you spend a lot of money, even though it's a good idea to do it, and you'd be running up the deficit and the debt, after all. So you have to worry about that too. But so it's interesting that downstream from the stimulus that came down under early Obama, the system cranked into getting away from it. That is, after the Republicans took over the Congress in the midterm of 2010, the next Congress really cranked down on debt and deficit. So they took a big bite out of through $2.7 billion through the sequestration and the fiscal cliff deal of early 2000, all that. I mean, it's very messy. We hated it. I mean, the government shut down a couple of times. We just hate what goes on. The optics of D.C. is terrible on these matters. But at the end of the line, as of 2015 or so, the American fisc is in pretty good shape in this sense. I mean, the result of it's pretty good. The debt as a proportion of GNP is below a 40-year average now. Now that's probably chiefly because we're coming out of the recession, but nonetheless, the government handling it from this. Not everybody agrees it's a good idea, after all, to do this somewhat bleaching of the economy. But nonetheless, from the standpoint of that deficit, the performance of the system, probably and of Congress, is pretty good. That having been said, I think that. You look back farther and take a closer or more fine-grained look, and probably over a long period of time, the system is somewhat dependent on the president to keep a debt deficit in line. Congress may just edge a little bit toward being profligate and foolish, not greatly, but on average over a long period of time. There's a considerable dependence probably on the presidents to be guardians of the fisc. And we see some of them doing a good job of it. I mean, Clinton and Bush 41, the father, and Eisenhower, for example. Roosevelt's pretty good at that, surprisingly. Franklin, Roosevelt are pretty good at guarding the fisc. We depend to a certain degree on presidents to do that.
Well, that is an interesting point, because I would imagine that Congress works either with the president or against the president. I mean, if you look today, President Obama has a very difficult time with Congress and getting Congress to do anything.
Sure.
If you look back at Reagan, for instance, a very different story.
Well, they fought too, you know.
Okay, well, I'm just
Tooth and
throwing
nail.
that out there. What do you think about that? I mean, in terms of Congress's imprint, I think sometimes it does have been influenced by its relationship with the sitting president, no?
Well, definitely. I mean, very often, after all, and certainly on these fiscal matters, what grinds out as a result of dealing between the president and the Congress, which is often conflictive. I'd say it's typically conflictive. Very seldom do you get very anywhere near perfect agreement between the White House on the one hand and the executive branch and the Congress on the other on these spending and taxing matters. So it's a grind all the way through. There's nothing new about that. It starts in 1789. There's nothing new about that.
Right.
Sometimes it exaggerates into more open conflict. As recently, that'll be when when the one party has the White House and the other has the Congress, for example.
Right.
Oh, I don't see any evidence, by the way, that the actual handling and the results of the fisc happens worse under conditions of divided party control than unified party control.
That's interesting.
Although the conflict is more open and nastier at those times, typically. But it was there under Reagan. I mean, Reagan against Tip O'Neill on fiscal matters in the 80s was recurrently a spectacle. But then Roosevelt used to fight with Democratic Congresses, Franklin Roosevelt. So,
okay, so overall, how would you characterize Congress's imprint on America up to this point?
Well, you take it over 225 years is a long time. Here are some of the things I would reach for. I think that Congress is very good at capacious representation of voters, put it that way. Now, if you're not a voter, you're in trouble. You don't count. And that was a big problem through most of American history with suffrage denial. But for accommodating the tastes, preferences, intensities of various parts of the voting population, Congress is pretty good, on average better than the president. There's nothing surprising about that. That's what legislatures do. So, and it's really good, I think, on that and doing that. Again, you got to be a voter. And what'll that mean is you'll get a lot of conflict and stalemate, because this is a very heterogeneous country all the way from the beginning. I mean, the universe of tastes out there and interests and preferences is really very heterogeneous. So you got to expect you're going to have a lot of fussing on Capitol Hill and a lot of non-action, inaction, inertia by somebody's judgment. It's always going to be the case that part of the public's not going to like what Congress is not doing or doing. That's just the way it is.
Right. The public might not like what they're doing, but I would argue that the public has nothing to do with Congress and what they're doing. It's the people who have all of the money, the 1%ers, control this country.
Yeah, that's not right with Congress now.
No?
Now, campaign contributions are pretty important, but you take right now, I mean, the Republicans are having trouble on Capitol Hill. You know, John Boehner and his coalition in the House, they're losing some of their right-wingers won't go along, really in the hair of Boehner. Why is that true? Well, I mean, if you're from the Arkansas 3rd District or from the Tennessee 6th District, you're a hero back home for what you say and what you do. So they don't have to go along with the party nationally or the country nationally. I mean, they can just thumb their nose and they'll get reelected. That's not a 1% thing. That's what it's like back in the Arkansas 3rd kind of thing. And that's the way it goes. That's the way it goes.
Okay. So,
but now there are other long-term effects. I think that Congress the U.S. is not very good at building and sustaining complicated, effective, efficient national bureaucracies. I mean, the way the Swedes or the Germans or the French do it. And I think it's been true all the way back. I think, except for the military, all the way back. And I think a reason for that is that Congress is very meddlesome. That is, they don't like bureaucrats. They don't fund bureaucrats very well. Think of the IRS today. It's a kind of sad outfit, but that's pretty much because over many decades and generations, Congress doesn't grease it well, doesn't give it enough money, enough employees, doesn't keep its IT operations in line. I mean, and that's typical, and all that. And one spin-off of that has been written about political scientists lately. The American welfare state is fairly small compared with those in European countries, and one reason for that probably is that it go back a century or so. I mean, the U.S. was really quite laggard in building effective national bureaucracies, the way the Social Security Agency basically is, but the U.S. was late there, and there's that problem. I think that another effect is that Congress in foreign policy has got different propensities from those of the presidency. I mean, the presidents are more, they're action-prone, active. They like to send drones off, or Jefferson sends the fleet to North Africa in 1807. The presidents do that sort of thing. Whereas Congress is more insular. They don't like to spend money abroad. They don't like excursions or adventures or abroad. They don't like commitments. When there's a difference between the institutions, usually there's not, but when they differ, Congress bends toward insularity. Right now they're giving Obama trouble on his Iranian. There's nothing new about that. They voted down the Kyoto Protocol 95-0. Under Clinton they did that. They're reluctant to enter into international commitments or international adventures. I mean, remember
Kyoto though was for pollution, right?
Excuse me? Yes, it was. That's correct. Right. Yeah, so, that's right. Right. That's correct. Now, I mean, Congress, going backwards, the 60s and 70s, was really out front in regulatory legislation and tailing the environment. Really. I mean, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, those are congressional enterprises. But you get into international commitments like the Kyoto Protocol, and they kind of draw back. I think that's partly for a reason. They drew back from the World Court in the 1930s. They drew back from the Versailles Treaty in 1919, just a little bit of reluctance to get into commitments. It's that.
Or to work with others outside of this country.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's on average, there. But also adventurous. I mean, remember a couple of years ago or whenever it was, when Obama was. It looked like he drew a red line and wanted to bomb Syria. Remember that was going on. There was another president about to bomb something. It became apparent he was going to go to Capitol Hill for approval of that. I think it became evident if he went there, they'd turn him down. So he drew back. There's an end. They talk on Capitol Hill, but they're probably going to vote him down. I mean, that's what happened at the British House of Commons when David Cameron, the Prime Minister, asked for such authority a little before Obama drew back and so forth. There's an instance of talking a lot. They talk a lot, but drawing back actually from doing something is fairly common. Otherwise, let's see, going back over a long period of time, what would I say? I think that, let me make this distinction. If you look at 225 years of influence, I think that of congressional influence, Congress is sometimes quite proactive in regulatory policy, that it's regulating business, as with the environmental legislation of the 60s and 70s. You go back a century to railroad regulation, to labor legislation. There's a lot of initiative on Capitol Hill for various stretches of history of regulating business. It's an American trademark, setting up business regulation through independent agencies. The Americans did that. They learned how to do that. So, but the other side of that, or rather a different aspect of the relation between the Congress and the economy, is that we don't have public ownership of things in the U.S. I mean, publicly owned this, that, or another, companies or whatever. I mean, thinking about the U.S. government running the Microsoft business, it seems it's kind of crazy to think it could even be done. So I think a reason for that is you try to set up you try to have the government actually run some productive outfit, productive agency, unit like that. And Congress is going to meddle. So it's clear up front that it's probably not a good idea.
Well, they stepped in when Detroit was going under with the car industry.
Oh, yes. Well, they'll give a subsidy. That's not a problem. And they took it over briefly, but then it went back. They did that. But they didn't want to run it. They kept arm's length from running it. They would subsidize it. They did that. And they got under the board and so forth, but they got it drew back. But they're not running those countries. They get the companies. There it is. I mean, yes. I mean, if you go down and say, let's propose a law to have the government run the steel industry, own it, they'd pay you crazy. It's just not going to work. There'd be too much meddling. So I think a reason for the unusual privateness of industry in the U.S. going back all the way back is that it's pretty clear that Congress, even though it's very good at maybe good at regulating things, it's not good at sustaining an environment in which the government actually can conduct large important operations.
So, last question. Moving forward, what are your thoughts on Congress and for the next 200 years, for instance? Pretty much same old, or do you forecast any changes happening?
Well, I don't see big changes. I mean, big changes can come about. Nobody knows really.
Right.
Nobody knows really if you could. But I think probably the best forecast, after all, we've been going on for 225 years, and there's a lot of continuity in the operations of it during that time, as there is, let's say, the British Parliament. So you get, there's a lot, there it is. There are customs, there are norms, and so on. If Congress, sometimes it gets out of line and does things that are not popular, but then that are shrinking back and are fussing with it. Generally, the public will take action sometimes. The courts, for example, 50 years ago, the districting of House districts was really out of line. It had gotten more and more out of line in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, whereupon the Supreme Court moved in and reconstructed, in a sense, the district base of the U.S. House of Representatives. These things can happen. I would say, the best bet is to just trundle on the way they're trundling, and lacking some immense disaster, and then immense disasters can happen, like severe security crises, or an asteroid hitting, or whatever, a nuclear attack, in which case, of course, you can get the demand for a tightening up of central control in a system. There's no question about that. Actually, I think now, one thing that, here's a thought that I have is that in foreign policy, there's often a loggerheads problem there, and as I say, Congress tends toward insularity, the presidency toward action proneness, and sometimes they just fight. There it is. Somebody wrote a book saying that Congress may not be anti-imperialism, but it's anti-executive. So sometimes just the friction between the institutions can have effects. I think that during the last century and a half, or 2 centuries actually, as the U.S. has been expanding and expanded on the North American economy, and then expanded to be the world hegemonic power in the 20th century, there was a certain amount of slack in the sense that the U.S. had a lot of power and a lot of resources, so it could make mistakes, or it could have internal conflict and confrontations and messiness that would not be finally fatal to the world. Although if we're now wheeling into a circumstance in which the U.S. is relatively a declining power, which is probably what's going to happen over the next 50 years or so, why then the sometimes messiness and loggerheads aspect of foreign policy making may become more of a problem. In a circumstance of declining power, there'll be less slack.
If we're declining, who's rising?
Yeah, relatively.
But if we're declining, the United States, who do you have pegged as rising?
Sure. I mean, across the whole world, China, sure. It's not as if it's necessarily a conflictive relationship, but the U.S. as a share of world power and money and resources is necessarily declining. There's no question about that, given China, given India, and so on. It's just that's the way it goes.
Right.
I mean, the peak of the American proportions in those respects was 1945, after World War II, when everybody else was in a shambles, or almost everybody. But then what with recovery and so on, there we are. We know that.
Okay. Well, it's been quite a pleasure to sit here and talk with you about this today.
It's a pleasure for me.
And we will look forward to your book, The Imprint of Congress, coming out toward the end of this year.
I hope so.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good. For more information about Professor Mayhew and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Please be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.